Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest of the Knowledge Miles 695th Lord Mayor's lecture series, where today we're going to be exploring whether disabled entrepreneurs are getting a fair deal in the city. So I'll give you a quick rundown how today's going to work. I'll introduce our illustrious speakers, Helen and Jacqueline, a little more in a moment, after which they're going to speak to us for about 20 minutes, and that should give us lots of times for Q&A. In terms of asking the questions, hopefully, if you look to the top right of your screen, you'll see there's a little chat call out thing with a question mark in the middle of it. Please put your questions in there. Please don't put them in the chat, and please don't raise your hand because they won't be seen. Will be ignored, and we'll miss your questions to the speakers. So we'll get through as many of the questions as we can, but have no fear if we don't. The questions do get sent on to the speakers along with your details so they can respond afterwards. And as I'm sure you already are well aware, the session's being recorded and there's a dedicated YouTube channel to which this will be posted so you can rewatch and share at your leisure. So no further ado, welcome Helen, Jacqueline. Thank you for giving up valuable time to come join us. Just by way of very quick introduction before I hand over to them. So Helen is professor of entrepreneurship business school at Birkbeck University of London, as well as director at the Centre for Innovation and Management Research. Research careers focused around the links between entrepreneurship, innovation, public policy and regional development in both a national and international context. Current research in the opportunities and barriers for disabled and ethnic minority entrepreneurs. Segue into today's topics. Joined, of course, by Jacqueline, who's founder and CEO of Universal Inclusion and the Inclusive Entrepreneur Network, now known as the Disabled Entrepreneur Network, best described as a global humanitarian and innovator with a deeply held and proven conviction to increase inequality of access to life's opportunities through the creation of inclusive environments and working practices. So this has made Jacqueline a recognised international expert and strategist on inclusion disability challenges. A thought leader in the reduction of global inequalities, her work's recognised for good practice in the UK and internationally, most notably in inclusive growth and inclusive entrepreneurship, workforce implementation of public policy. And together, which brings them together, they are co-authors of The Road to Wonder, which is, I think, what we're going to hear about today, a study in exploring the barriers and opportunities to create an enterprise and innovation by disabled people. That's more than enough from me, so I should hand over to you, Helen, Jacqueline. Look forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm going to begin by talking a bit about the Road to Wonder study. This builds on previous research funded by Innovate UK on innovation and inclusivity. We did a study in 2019 looking at innovation by disabled people and people from ethnic diverse backgrounds. I then did a study funded by the Regional Studies Association, which looked at the professional networks which support disabled and ethnic minority entrepreneurs. And during that study, I met Jacqueline. I interviewed her as one of the people who was leading a network, which you've just been hearing about. And from that, we put in a bid, and Jacqueline explained a bit more about the background to Innovate UK to do this study. So one of the features of this study is that it provides a very extensive evidence base. So we surveyed lots of people. We got through to 1,300 people who replied with completed surveys by 435 disabled entrepreneurial innovators. We undertook focus groups, interviews. We looked at labour force survey data. We did extensive reviews of grey literature, so Federation of Small Businesses report, the Lending Standards report, DWP, as well as the academic literature. So we have a fairly clear idea of some of the issues relating to disability and entrepreneurship, but this is only the start. And this is an ongoing enterprise that Jacqueline and I are undertaking through the innovation management research and the policy arenas in which Jacqueline is engaged in. So I'll hand you over to Jacqueline now.
Lovely, thank you. So following on from that lovely introduction from Helen and Could I just say initially, bear with me because I'm not able to view the slide in full screen at the moment, so I might have to slightly look to my right. So apologies. And just to put things into context today and to position this and how we've taken our work forward, and full disclosure, I am a disabled entrepreneur. So you might have to bear with me on a few things today as well. What was really unique about this study is it was instigated by disabled people. It's been led by disabled people, both through the APPG for Inclusive Entrepreneurship, where it actually formed part of the work programme. And as Helen's already said, the way we actually engaged everybody to actually make sure this was a true reflection of the lived experience of disabled people when they look to create innovation enterprise. Now, what we're going to talk about in our question today is about a fair deal. And I'm going to talk to you about a few of the barriers that came out in our study, and not wanting to dwell on that, because alongside the barriers, what we've discovered, because the study looked beyond the who, the why, the what, the where and the when, but brought out some really interesting aspects of what are the factors that actually prevent this growth and how can we make sure that they're effectively resourced going forward. So perception and discrimination is massive. So from practically across all the people we spoke to had a view that generally within the entrepreneurial arena, the perception across the board was not of one that our sector could lead, could innovate, could create enterprise. The intersectionality was a huge factor, so that when disabled people are in this space, they're often not doing that in isolation. There are other, what we might call in the UK, protected characteristics that influence things as well. So they have multiple levels of barriers and, in their words, discrimination that they face on a daily basis. Accessing finance. Now, you might say, well, all entrepreneurs consider accessing finance a huge barrier. But in this sector, it's more significant because all of the things that we're talking about in terms of barriers, they're all interacting with each other. They're complex and they're influencing, so you can't say, oh, there's one particular barrier. All of these barriers come into play. And as we're talking about the barriers, where we've seen movements in these areas, we're going to reference that as well. And I think when we're talking about finance, what's really important is there are moves in play. So organisations like Innovate UK, the Lending Standards Board had produced some insight reports, and those are available for you in reference at the end of the slides, that actually started to provide a safe space for banks and financial services to actually start to look at this issue. So yes, it's a huge barrier because generally disabled people don't have the track record that might be required to access traditional finance. But we are starting to see as well within the social investment sector, the angel investment sector, that people are starting to look at this now and starting to take our sector seriously. A lack of practical disability-related support. Now, we are quite lucky in the UK that we have access to what's known as and regarded globally as something that is a fantastic programme called the Access to Work Award. Where else in the world does government put forward a substantial package to support people to remain in an employed or a self-employed arena to the level that they do? It's unheard of, really, and we have that in the UK. Now, the flip side to that is that sometimes when programs are put in place, what we see, and as we saw in our study, there are unintended consequences where you don't have joined up thinking. So, for example, at the moment, you have this wonderful award that when it's in place, our respondents told us it's game-changing. And there's a direct correlation between somebody acquiring an Access to Work award and going on to create innovation and enterprise. However, it's conflicted in its administration. As people find out about it, it becomes it's quite complex to acquire it anyway. But for example, at the moment, there's a waiting list of up to 24 weeks from somebody making an application to being granted an award. And there are some anomalies within it. So for example, if you have to have a certain level of turnover within a relatively early time of starting your business. And if you don't reach that, you can lose the award. So whilst we have some, that's a massive programme, it's a fantastic programme, the downsides of that make it quite conflicting for people who are in this space. And that was reflected quite strongly in our study. At the moment, it's only through the Access to Work Award that people are able to get access to finance for those essential practical disability support elements. And again, we're going to come back to this later, but a more joined up system would really help that. A lack of bespoke business support. So our sector does need business support, but we navigate our business and how our day-to-day things impact on us in very different ways. And the business support that's out there needs to reflect that. The lack of a health and wellbeing strand. So when people are looking at effectively resourcing this sector, they sometimes forget the aspect of health and wellbeing. If we don't get that right, we won't run our businesses as effectively as we could. So again, that came out really strongly. People felt they were often excluded from innovation programs and activities. Often these things were perceived as something that were actually done to the sector rather than engaging with the sector as collaborators and leaders and experts in their own field. They felt excluded from dialogues around policy, design and practice. And I think that possibly we've seen that quite recently, and it's an ongoing theme. So we've had a general election and a reappointment of various ministers. And once again, we see that the minister with responsibility for this area has the title of Social Security, and it's placed in the Department for Work and Pensions. So again, how we're actually looking at where this should sit, where the support for this should sit, where the innovation will grow from. Perhaps sometimes policy looks at the welfare section rather than the innovation business section to put the essential drive to take this forward. Conflict between the intent and administration of various programs. So we've seen repeated programs put into place to try to increase not only the employed arena, but also the self-employed arena. They're subjective to and reliant upon the interdepartmental working, which doesn't always work in either sector's favour, really. And that came out again really strongly in our study, and as you'll see later in our recommendations. What has come out really strongly in this report is that where there is effective resourcing and the practical things that are required, there is substantial growth in the creation of innovation and enterprise from our sector. And that doesn't just grow the sector. So I talked briefly about the Access to Work Award. Every penny that is put into the sector via the Access to Work Award goes back into the economy. It doesn't go directly to the individual. It goes to pay for support workers, aids and adaptations, boosting those industries, and for training that would be required to support you to navigate how things present for you as you grow your business. Thank you. I'm actually going to go on to the next slide, please. When we look at the barriers that have come out from our report and the breadth of innovation that's taking place, and there are some wonderful businesses growing, there are other contributory factors. So we know that in our sector, we're subject to the disability employment gap, which currently sits at 27.9%. The disability pay gap sitting at 20.2%. And that is perhaps indicative of why we're seeing a growth in the number of disabled people who are choosing to go towards creating innovation and enterprise rather than going into the employed arena. And it's actually making up 14% of the total self-employed workforce compared to 9% of our non-disabled peers. And is reflected in the Lord Mayor's appeal, which we were delighted to see when we were invited to contribute to this lecture today. The initiative, The Power of Inclusion, and highlighting the role of the Sustainable Development Goals in taking this forward. And of course, a key thing that came out of our report was most disabled people who are taking this route are working from home. So we also have to factor into this as we want to look at how things can be improved and a fairer deal developed is the lack of accessible housing and adequate health and social care. The creation of innovation and enterprise as a work stream cannot sit in isolation of these other things. Everything needs to be joined up. And what we're going to talk about a little bit further on in our presentation for this to work and get better. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Right, I'm going to talk about the programmes. The Local Policy Innovation Partnership was a UKRI initiative, and what they were proposing to do was throughout the country getting groups together to try and solve a common problem. So I started working with Jacqueline to look at what could be done in London to increase inclusivity for entrepreneurship within the capital region. So we used our networks and included organisations like the London Chamber, London Hire, Arup, to put together a proposal to apply for one of these stage 1. I also approached the GLA. The GLA very kindly wrote me a letter of support, and then they said, oh, by the way, we are working with LRAP, and they are doing a bid on retrofitting London. So I didn't know anything about retrofitting, but it seemed a good idea that as they weren't looking at the inclusivity angle, for us to join forces. So we were brought in to help provide the insights into why that bid should be looking at people with disability and ethnic minorities in working together to finding solutions to how you deal with retrofitting. And obviously people with disability are particularly affected by issues relating to retrofitting. So we did this. Jacqueline and I were involved in discussions. They had World Cafe activities, and we put forward a series of recommendations about how you would include inclusivity and what other models there were. And Jacqueline can talk about some of the examples that she has first-hand experience of how you get younger people to be entrepreneurial and help them develop the right kinds of skills to addressing these kinds of problems within London. So that all seemed to go very well. We came up with a set of recommendations and conclusions, and we went forward to phase 2. So what phase 2 was going to do was to build on this analysis. We were looking to how the development of inclusive retrofit skills could be accelerated to help improve the pipelines of people with disabilities into entrepreneurship and into other professions related to the retrofit sector. So a lot of organisations were involved across the capital. I don't know whether some of you here or Mark knew anything about this bid, but this LRAP organisation is going forward. But in the end, we didn't get the bid. But what was interesting for us was that it raised all sorts of issues about when you're trying to solve sector problems, what kinds of initiatives do you need to undertake, and who should be involved in making the decisions, including, as Jacqueline says, getting people with disabilities into that conversation to explain how they would approach it, rather than it being innovation for disabled people. It's innovation by disabled people to address these common problems. So this is where we are with this problem. This is the work that we have been doing on London, and our Road to Wonder report came up with London-specific issues that we were including in this retrofit bid. But we're not finished with this. We are still looking for ways in which we can take this work forward within London. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so Jacqueline, the next, over to you.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I hope that we've given you a little insight into the potential for growth in this sector. And I can't overemphasize what we saw in the study in terms of the different industries, the different way people were actually approaching this, what they were achieving, the turnover, their contribution, often beyond actually their own turnover, and the way this was actually almost like mushrooming and just growing without the kind of support that we're wanting to see. And it just really does make you think the huge potential if this sector was resourced effectively. Some of the things that we gauge from the study as well is that going back to sometimes these conflicting areas. So, for example, we had a strong presentation in terms of how welfare restrictions can stunt growth, where somebody can only work so many hours and they can only earn so much money. So again, it's very difficult to grow the business. But what was clear was it's almost like what we're wanting to talk about is, and what we're going to propose to you, is a paradigm shift. So traditionally, when people think about the issue about the disability employment gap, pay gap, etc., sadly, what we want to move away from is disabled people being seen as the kind of tax stroke health and social care burdens. And that came out really strongly. People do not want to have that label. And to maybe take a leap of faith and look at this in a different way, not to automatically think this issue means welfare. This has got to be a welfare issue, a welfare reform issue, and start to look at this as actually giving disabled people around policy responses as potential leaders in the creation of innovation and enterprise, and collaborate with this sector to actually not see this as a problem, but just see this as an absolute opportunity to really kind of change that cycle of poverty and the growth that, you know, I'm probably soapboxing a bit, but you'd have to have seen what we've seen and to have the vision then to know how this can actually completely turn all of this on its head. And it is a solution when you do effectively resource this sector. Thank you, Helen.
Right. So the next slide, please.
Oh, sorry, Helen, because I think, if you could just go back, please. I'm sorry, it may be that I missed a cue there. So the thing that we've also included on this slide is why are disabled entrepreneurs important to the London economy? With the effective support in this scenario, rather than a welfare scenario, it will change perception. It will increase cross-sector ethical collaboration and effective resourcing. It will reduce the disability employment and pay gap. We've already seen that. What we found with the study, when people are given these opportunities, they very quickly go on to come off benefits and different things, because contrary sometimes to popular belief, that isn't where people want to be. Breaking that cycle of poverty, placing disabled people in leadership roles, increasing inclusive economic growth, and a massive factor from our study, we knew it anecdotally, but it was really great to see it within our study. the impact it has on increasing positive health and well-being, particularly around the use of antidepressants and opioids. People told us that once they were given this opportunity, as opposed to perhaps the option to remain on benefits, etc., they felt more hopeful, their self-esteem increased, and they were doing what they wanted to do, which was just to live life and experience the same opportunities as everybody else, and to be contributing. And I think that's probably, we'll leave that there on that point. But at the moment, our answer to the question, are disabled entrepreneurs in London getting a fair deal? Our answer would be no. But we're hoping that with solutions that we're proposing to you, we can change that going forward. Thank you, Helen.
Okay. Great. And then
Next
the
slide.
next, please. Yes. So
Okay.
what we've seen through our own experience of ethical collaboration and understanding the dynamics of the policy agenda in different regions, because each region, as we know from London, has its London Assembly. There are different bodies that exist in London that aren't available elsewhere. The London Chamber of Commerce has its own characteristics. So what we were proposing, that London sets up its own neutral body to undertake ethical collaboration with a view to including more disabled people and their support workers and the networks around disabled people to work together to come up with some of the solutions to the underrepresentation of disabled people in entrepreneurship and innovation within the London economy. So if you have a neutral body that involves these different actors, then you can come up with a strategy that says these are the steps we need to take in order to increase access to resources, as Jacqueline's been talking about, and also change the perception of disabled entrepreneurs and give them a platform to which to speak from, so that will change the system. So we are talking about system change in the way of perceptions, engagement with different parties, and building respect so that there are opportunities for London to create an environment that says we're really good at this, and there are lessons to be learned throughout the rest of the UK, but also London can listen to other parts of the UK and learn lessons from what's been adopted there. So there's a very strong case for a London environment to take hold of this topic and take it forward. So if I hand you over to Jacqueline to pick up on the follow-up on that.
Thank you. What underpins all of our work that we've done individually prior to collaborating, but going forward, is the importance of that ethical collaboration between policy, practice, and academia. So the work we do around, where we're in recess at the moment, working through the all-party parliamentary groups, we started one that looked at inclusive entrepreneurship. Going forward, we're hoping to have one that looks at innovative, inclusive entrepreneurship. And that helps to bring things together on a cross-party basis, but also collaboration across all of the organisations that have an interest in this. And it's really important that we have well-designed government initiatives. And what we're very keen to do is encourage people that have an interest in this area to get engaged with the APPGs and actually help to inform parliamentarians on how this can be done, how this can be achieved, and how by taking a different look at this and really having that sort of, we call it leap of faith approach to this, it will change things for the better.
Coming back to the London situation, when we looked at the survey data, we saw that London has some distinctive features to do with disabled entrepreneurship. So there were some kinds of innovation that were more prevalent in London. It was developing products new to the world that were more prevalent in London and other parts of the country. But on the other hand, when we looked at the networks, London far less well networked than other parts of the country, and we can't explain why that happens. And we also found that the Access to Work Award was less well used or less successful for London entrepreneurs. But we know in the Northwest, there's a much greater success rate in getting the Access to Work Award. It's possibly that's where Jacqueline lives and works, but Jacqueline obviously has a nationwide network support. But I think when you're looking at the London economy, we need to be aware of the specifics of London, about the population base, about the skill base, about the institutions and how they vary and where the levers of power are to bring about system change within the London economy. So that's why the regional factors are in that list.
Mm-hmm. Our next thing in terms of our key recommendations from the study was that need for a cultural shift. And I think I've probably spoken a lot about that in our lecture today. And we cannot overemphasize the need for that if this is going to change going forward. And I'm going to move on to the next one, which is actually understanding the value of resourcing this sector and the knock-on effect on positive health and well-being. And by the very definition of that, the reduction in, if people are going to talk about budgets, we know from the entrepreneurs that have been involved in this study that their usage of healthcare services diminished when they were able to be effectively resourced and start and grow a business. Over to you, Helen, for the next one.
Okay. So Jacqueline has already mentioned the importance of intersectional discrimination. So we know that disabled people are also women, they're from ethnic minorities, and this combination of factors can inhibit access to resources. So although we've been focusing on disabled entrepreneurs, there are these other aspects that when we're looking at the nature of the problems, we do have to understand those aspects of people's lived experience.
Okay. And finally, in our list of recommendations from the report that we've pulled out today, and I would encourage people to actually have a look at the report in more detail because it's fascinating. Not that we're biased, but it is fascinating. Is promoting awareness of this sector, what is possible, and the ethical collaboration that's already being achieved, but will be needed in threefold going forward. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Yes, well, just to sum up, we've highlighted some of the areas that we found really interesting and important. And some of those are related to the health and well-being aspects. So we know that people are happier once they've been properly resourced to be innovative, but we also know that there are downsides, that if people aren't properly resourced, then that leads to stress and unhappiness. So there's a whole strand of research about the conditions under which health and well-being is enabled, better health and well-being is enabled by appropriate resourcing. And this aspect of innovation, Innovate UK were clearly very interested in innovation, but we don't know very much about the nature of innovation. We have the survey results, but there's far more to understand about the factors which leading to innovations of which kind and how those innovations are commercialized to best effect. So there's a whole strand related to innovation with it that we are working on. And I think we'll stop on that one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gosh, that was hugely powerful. Thank you. I very purposely let you overrun because I thought it was more important to hear your voices than the questions coming through. So, but we hit that point. So if there are some questions, do please keep putting on the chat. I'm going to kick off a bit of personal reflection. I mean, we met for the first time before the call and kind of established that, you know, I navigate around entrepreneurship personally, but more importantly in context to this, that current serving master at the Company of Entrepreneurs in the city, so very much in purview. And I love what you talk about with, to me, alternative abilities, not disabilities. And I think it's a well-worn and known fact that most entrepreneurs come from a divergent background, whether that's socioeconomic, whether it's neurodivergent, physical divergent. Why? Because you solve big life problems. And if you solve big life problems, you can solve other people's problems. And there's a power and a persuasion that comes from that. So I found that personally very, very, very powerful sitting in there. And I think one must reflect that when we think about the UK, 99.9% of the businesses in the UK are SMEs, 98% in the City of London are SMEs, and these are driven by people that set businesses up. So, I think there's a kind of very powerful bit there. And I kind of despair that this is seen as on the margins, not in the middle. So I am getting to a question of my own in this. And I'm massively interested to explore more about the government intervention or lack thereof. I mean, the thought that this sits in Department of Social Security, where it should be in the Department of Trade or innovation sitting out there, is just bizarre in its first place. Given that the Labour government has now set its stall on solving our current economic crisis by innovation and wealth growth and wealth in the economy, are they really listening to what you're saying? And you're at the start of a cycle. What can happen in the next 5 years to make them listen if they're not?
Well, if we can start off with Jacqueline and I gave evidence to the Department of Work and Pensions Select Committee, and we were specifically talking about entrepreneurship and disability because the Select Committee was looking at employment. And our argument was that they need to look at entrepreneurship and self-employment. And the chair, Stephen Timms, was on the money there, because he recognised that, as you were suggesting, this topic has been on the margins. So we were going to be part of a report, and the report was going to come out from that select committee. And of course, general election happened, so that's not happened. That report is not going to be public. So what we're hoping is that Stephen Timms is going to take this further forward. But it's early days, but we do hope so. But we were pushing him on this because he's heard us speak on this topic.
And just to add to that, so throughout the work that we've done, and not just through obviously the network and then the creation of the APPG, the authoritative voice of people that are doing this is a request, and a request through the work programme is that this is placed in whatever terminology the department might have, more in a department that looks at innovation and business, and not where it's placed at the moment. And we'll continue to call for that, really. But it also takes us back to, at the moment we are in recess, and we're hoping to be successful again in creating an APPG when Parliament returns, and continuing with the work through that process, because it was making headway. It's basically for government to continue through that process to actually listen to people that are actually doing this and respond proactively. And to be fair, I would say sort of 4 months ago, that willingness was there to actually take the recommendations forward. Sadly, I think if we have any hurdles that we will need to cross, it's sometimes that you're going down that route and then you get a curveball because another initiative starts somewhere, and it tends to delay matters. So again, and that's why we've called for this, whatever, however we do it, whether it's a commission or whatever, and a department that has responsibility for this, beyond the kind of sometimes the political changes that can perhaps hinder this area of work, because it's so important. If you look at what we're hearing all the time at the moment, it is about, people are talking about welfare budgets, they're talking about health budgets, and for something that is possibly as influential in actually really turning that around, it needs to be taken seriously and placed where it can actually achieve its full potential.
Okay, thank you. We have a question, and funny to about being on the margins. The question says, it seems like a big part of the changing perceptions is humanising disabled people in the public eye and challenging the associations around welfare. How do we successfully prompt this cultural shift? And are there other societal groups that can benefit from this?
Do you want me to take that, Helen?
Yeah,
or?
yes,
Okay.
please.
All right, thank you. This is really interesting because every sector that I've worked in, what I found is that genuinely people, I would call this the last bastion, if you will. So organisations have looked at issues around minority ethnic, moves forward, gender, etc. But in this field, irrespective of whether it's employment, housing, whatever it is, organisations seem to, when we first start to work with them, almost like be quite fearful of getting things wrong. And that sometimes stops them from doing things at all. When you work collaboratively, and those collaborations are led by the organisations that are actually excluded, and often as simple as getting people in the same room, because it's remarkable what suddenly happens. And I'm going to give a strange example actually, but it's a really important example of a scenario earlier in my career where a young child was being told that they couldn't access childcare because they hadn't had their wheelchair assessed to access that particular thing. It was assessed for somewhere else. Bringing everybody in the same room and listening to everybody put their point forward, and at a certain point, everybody looked at each other and thought, what are we doing? And that's what can happen, and that's what needs to happen. Alongside, massively government have a role to play in this, in the narrative and, you know, promoting our sector in a much more positive way. So, for example, the organisations that we might look at, for example, rail services. So doing some work with rail services who can start to do public information videos that talk about disabled people wanting to use the rail service as they're going around their daily lives creating innovation in business. So there's lots of different ways of doing this. And, you know, some people think it's just a huge thing and where do you actually start? But it starts at the top. Government have the ability to completely change this, to change that narrative, but they need to do it in partnership with the sector to be able to do it effectively, and it not be something that's just once again done to the sector, but led by the sector.
I think there's an interesting adjunct to that in that much of the world of innovation, so kind of startup young entrepreneurs, now get to work in innovation labs, hubs, you know, accelerators. So the physical presence of being around, you know, other entrepreneurs is very infectious, and you have that support. So this is about workplace adaptation. You know, I mean, the general workplace isn't very good at it. They're learning slowly. Is it quicker? Is it recognised in the accelerators, in the physical space accelerators, that, you know, it's a for all, or is it still set up for the abled? You know, I'm thinking more physically abled.
It is changing, but it's changing slowly. So what came out in a lot of what we did in the study, we knew anecdotally, but we wanted an academic study. And what came out really strongly was that people had set up bespoke networks because there wasn't that inclusive space around, whether it be accelerator programs, whether it be initiatives, banking, etc. So what we saw, and those networks are still going strongly, if rather underfunded, where people couldn't access that, they were creating their own. So you started to see those things developing. We've started to see organisations like Innovate UK who, you know, understood the need to change and understood the need to develop. But it is a learning process. And again, it brings us back to the importance of having disabled people on the judging panel, involved in the development of these things going forward. So what we would say at the moment is it's on the cusp. Yeah. And it's really important that we don't let it slip back. It's really important that now that government actually really takes hold of this and actually champions it, recognises it for what it can do. And when it's looking at all of these programs, whether it be government accelerator programs or the funding they put into other programs, that it's an integral part of it.
Okay. I could spend the rest of the afternoon listening to you. Sadly, we've run out of time, and in fact, we've overrun in time. So I'm going to have to draw a close there. As on the screen, we've got some more lectures coming up over the coming weeks. So I should leave you to have a very quick look at those. Really, it's just to kind of wrap up with some thank yous. Obviously a very, very special thank you to you, Jacqueline, Helen, for giving up time and sharing such a powerful story with us. So I think there's lots to follow up. I can't read it, but there was a very big thank you to you for the deck and some of the stats in the deck, and they're going to pick that up. So I think you might find some people reaching out to you afterwards. So thank you both for the great work you're doing. Please keep the great work going. And I will speak on behalf of the company entrepreneurs. We'll help you where we can along the way, because we have a shared interest in this. Always thank you to the Lord Mayor for putting this series together. And today demonstrates just how fabulous it is, and it's been such a great thing throughout his year. Thank you to ZN for always organising these. I think Sasha's sitting in the background somewhere for the great work he's been doing on this and others. Thank you to the audience for staying attentive, staying with us, and putting the questions up for me to share. So that's about it, really. So it's just to say, wish you a rest of your week is good, happy, successful, and the weekend's round the corner. And I saw there were big yellow blobs on the weather map, so I think we've all got nice weekends coming up. So thank you very much, and goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.